Grace stood alone beside 3 fresh-turned mounds of earth as sunrise broke over the prairie. The dirt was still dark from night dew. Her hands were raw from digging, nails split and bleeding. She'd worked through darkness while the camp slept, refusing help from strangers who'd already done enough. Cholera had taken them in 3 days. First her mother, then her father. Finally David. Her husband had been strong that morning, weak by noon, gone by nightfall. The fever burned through their wagon like wildfire through dry grass. Now Grace stood in yesterday's dress, staring at graves that held everything she'd been. Captain Morrison approached, hat in weathered hands. His face carried the weariness of a man who'd buried too many on this trail. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss," he said, "but the train moves at first light. We can't wait longer." Grace nodded. She'd known this was coming. "We'll leave you supplies," Morrison continued. "Rifle, ammunition, enough food for a month. Maybe a wagon heading back east will pass through. You could return to—" "I have no one back east," Grace said. Her voice sounded hollow, like wind through an empty cabin. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then I'm sorry. But cholera's behind us now, and we have to keep moving. Families are counting on making the valley before snow. Around them." The camp stirred to life. Mothers called children to breakfast. Men hitched oxen to wagons. The sounds of continuation, of life pressing forward while hers had stopped. Grace watched a little girl with yellow braids chase her brother between the wagons, their laughter bright in the morning air. She'd wanted children. David had promised they'd have a houseful once they reached Oregon. The lead wagon creaked into motion. Then another. The train stretched out like a great serpent uncoiling across the prairie, heading toward mountains that rose purple in the distance. Mountains Grace would never cross. She stood beside the graves as the wagons rolled past. Some families nodded respectfully. Others looked away, as if grief might be catching. The children stared openly, until their mothers pulled them close and hurried them along. Within an hour, the last wagon disappeared over the western rise. Wheel ruts stretched across the grass, pointing toward a future Grace no longer had. The prairie fell silent except for wind moving through the tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling. Overhead, she looked down at the 3 mounds, David, Mama, Papa, all the people who'd known her name, who'd carried her history, gone into earth that would never know their stories, marked only by stones she'd piled with trembling hands. The sun climbed higher. The day would be hot. Grace didn't move. She had nowhere to go. "Papa, that lady's all alone." Emma's small hand tugged Michael's sleeve. He looked up from securing the water barrel to see his daughter pointing back toward the 3 graves on the horizon. A figure stood motionless beside them, dark against the morning sky. "She's crying," Emma said, though they were too far to see tears. Michael's son Thomas pressed against his other side. "Her people are in the ground, aren't they?" "Yes, son." Michael's chest tightened with familiar ache. He knew what it meant to stand beside fresh graves. "Are we just leaving her?" Emma's voice carried accusation that only a 7-year-old could manage. Michael glanced at the wagon train stretched ahead. Captain Morrison had already made the decision. One woman couldn't stop 50 families from reaching the valley before winter. The trail was hard that way, practical to the point of cruelty. But Emma was right. They were leaving her. "Thomas, watch your sisters," Michael said. He turned his wagon out of line, ignoring Morrison's shouted protest. The woman didn't look up as his wagon approached. She stood with her back straight, hands folded, staring at nothing. Her dress was stained with dirt and other things Michael didn't want to name. Her face was young, maybe 25, but her eyes looked ancient. "Ma'am," Michael said, removing his hat. His children clustered behind him, Sarah clinging to Emma's hand. The woman turned slowly. Her eyes were dry now, but red-rimmed. "I'm Michael Fletcher," he said. These are my children Emma, Thomas, and Sarah. We're heading to the Oregon Valley. He paused. We have space in our wagon. Trail's no place for solitude. You're welcome to travel with us if you've a mind to. She stared at him. For a long moment. She didn't speak. Why, her voice was barely a whisper. Because my children are watching. Michael said honestly. And because I know what it means to stand alone. Her gaze shifted to the children. Emma stepped forward, all earnest determination. You can't stay here by yourself, Emma said. It's not safe. We have extra blankets. Thomas added. Little Sarah just nodded solemnly, thumb in her mouth. The woman's throat worked. I don't know your names, she said finally. I'm Emma. That's Thomas. The little one is Sarah. Grace, the woman whispered. I'm Grace. Will you come with us? Miss Grace, Emma asked. Grace looked back at the graves one more time. Then she nodded once, sharp and final. I'll earn my passage, she said to Michael. I can cook, mend clothes, help with the children. That's fair, Michael agreed. Let's gather your things. There wasn't much. A trunk with clothing, a few cooking pots, a quilt her mother had made. The children helped carry everything to Michael's wagon while Grace stood motionless, as if her body had moved but her spirit remained behind. When everything was loaded, Michael offered his hand to help her up. She took it, her fingers cold despite the warming day. As the wagon rolled forward to rejoin the train, Grace sat among barrels and crates. Hands folded in her lap, she didn't look back again. The wagon rocked with the rhythm of wheels over prairie grass. Grace sat perfectly still, surrounded by the sounds of a family that wasn't hers. The children whispered together in the front. Michael's voice rumbled as he spoke to the oxen. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life. Her own life felt like something she'd read about in a book. Distant and unreal. She'd married David when she was 19. He'd been strong and certain, full of plans for their future. Oregon meant land, opportunity, a farm where they'd raise children and grow old together. Her parents had decided to come too, selling everything they owned for one last adventure. The fever had started in her mother first, chills and vomiting. By the time they realized it was cholera, her father had it too. David had nursed them both while Grace boiled water and prayed, but cholera didn't care about prayer. Her mother died calling for Grace's father. He followed 6 hours later. David made it through that night, but the next morning he couldn't stand. By evening, his lips were blue and his skin felt like ice despite the fever. Take care of yourself, he'd whispered, his last words. Grace had screamed until her throat bled, but David was gone. Miss Grace. She blinked. Emma was watching her with those solemn brown eyes. Are you hungry? Papa has jerky and biscuits. No, thank you. Grace's stomach hadn't accepted food in days. Thomas leaned over the seat back. Papa says you'll help with cooking. Mama used to make the best cornbread. Do you know how to make cornbread? Grace's chest constricted. Your mama. The children's faces fell. Michael spoke without turning. My wife Martha passed 2 years back, birthing Sarah. She wanted this journey for our children, wanted them to have land and opportunity. I promised I'd bring them here. I'm sorry, Grace whispered. So are we. Michael said, but we keep moving forward. That's all we can do. The wagon crested a low rise. Behind them, the 3 graves had finally disappeared from view. Grace felt something tear inside her chest, like a rope pulled too tight finally snapping. She was facing forward now. There was nothing behind her but dirt and memory. What happens when we reach Oregon? She asked. We file land claims, Michael said. Build cabins before winter. Plant come spring. He glanced back. You'll earn your passage helping with the children and camp work. When we reach the valley, you're free to go your own way or stay near the settlement. Your choice. I understand. But Grace didn't understand anything anymore. She didn't understand why she'd lived when everyone she loved had died. Didn't understand why this stranger had turned his wagon around for her. Didn't understand how to keep breathing when her heart felt like a stone in her chest. Sarah climbed into the back, plopped down beside Grace, and rested her small head against Grace's arm. "You smell like flowers," Sarah said. Grace looked down at the child. 4 years old, thumb-worn and sleepy. This little girl had never known her mother. Carefully, Grace put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. The child snuggled closer. "That's lavender soap," Grace whispered. "My mama made it. I like it," Sarah said, and closed her eyes. Grace held very still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was happening. Her hands were still trembling, but for the first time since the graves, she felt something besides emptiness. The wagon rolled on toward distant mountains, carrying Grace away from everything she'd been and toward something she couldn't yet imagine. Grace woke before dawn had properly broken. Old habit from years of farm life drove her from her bedroll before thought could catch up. Around her, the wagon train still slept. Fires had burned down to coals. The air smelled of dew and sage. She rebuilt Michael's fire first, working quietly so the children wouldn't wake. When flames caught and held, she started coffee in the battered pot. By the time other families began stirring, Grace had biscuits baking in the Dutch oven and salt pork sizzling in the pan. Michael emerged from beneath the wagon where he slept, giving the children the covered space. He stopped when he saw breakfast ready. "You didn't have to." "I said I'd earn my passage." Grace poured coffee into his cup. "This is how I know to do it." He accepted the cup, studying her face. "Did you sleep enough?" A lie, but a kind one. The children tumbled out, drawn by food smells. They ate with the enthusiastic focus of young ones who'd worked hard the day before. Grace watched them, learning their rhythms. Emma was careful and thoughtful. Thomas was quick and curious. Sarah was quiet but observant. After breakfast, the train rolled forward. Grace walked alongside the wagon to spare the oxen her weight. Other women walked too, children darting between the adults. Some nodded to Grace. Others whispered behind their hands. She heard the word widow and alone and tragedy. Let them whisper. She had work to do. At midday rest, she mended a tear in Emma's dress. Thomas brought her wildflowers he'd picked along the trail, bright yellow and purple blooms. "For you," he said shyly. Grace's throat closed. "Thank you, Thomas. They're beautiful." "Mama liked flowers," he said, then ran off before emotion could catch him. That evening, Grace helped other families too. She showed Mrs. Patterson how to get smoke out of venison. She held the Morrison baby while his mother dealt with a broken wagon wheel. She worked until her body ached and her mind went quiet. After supper, the children gathered around their father for the evening story. Grace started to move away, give them privacy. But Emma caught her hand. "Stay, Aunt Grace." The title landed soft but definite. Not Miss Grace anymore. Aunt Grace. Grace looked at Michael. He nodded permission. She sat on the edge of the circle while Michael spun a tale about a clever rabbit who outwitted a fox. The children laughed at the right parts. When Sarah's eyes grew heavy, she crawled into Grace's lap without asking. Just climbed up and settled in like it was the most natural thing in the world. Grace's arms came around the child before thought could interfere. Sarah was warm and solid, smelling of dust and little girl sweat. Her breathing slowed, deepened. Michael finished the story. Emma and Thomas drifted to their bedrolls. Grace sat holding Sarah, afraid to move, afraid to shatter this moment. "You're good with them," Michael said quietly. "They're easy to love." The words escaped before Grace could stop them. Something shifted in Michael's expression. Sadness, maybe. or understanding. Martha would have liked you. Grace looked down at Sarah's sleeping face. Something in her chest that had been frozen solid since the graves loosened just slightly. Not melting, not yet, but cracking, letting in the smallest sliver of warmth. She carried Sarah to her bedroll and tucked her in. Emma and Thomas were already asleep, breathing deep and even. Michael watched from the fire. "Thank you, Grace." "For what?" "For staying." Grace nodded and moved to her own bedroll. She lay staring at stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on dark cloth. Somewhere nearby, a coyote called. The camp settled into sleeping sounds, for the first time in a week. Grace closed her eyes without seeing David's face going gray with death. Instead, she saw Sarah's trusting smile and Thomas's wildflowers and Emma calling her Aunt Grace. It was dangerous, this opening in her chest. Dangerous to let herself care again. But she was too tired to fight it tonight. The river came up faster than expected, swollen with mountain snowmelt. Captain Morrison called a halt while scouts found the best crossing point. The water ran dark and quick, carrying broken branches and foam. "We cross in groups," Morrison announced. "Steady and careful, children secured inside wagons." Grace helped Emma gather the younger children, while Michael checked the wagon rigging. Other families prepared around them. Mothers tucking children safely inside covered spaces. Fathers double-checking wheels and axles. "I'm scared," Sarah whispered. Grace knelt beside her. "Your papa's crossed rivers before. He knows what he's doing. Will you stay with us?" "Every step." Michael called them forward. His wagon was third in line. Grace climbed up beside the children while Michael guided the oxen into the current. The water hit the wheels with shocking force. The wagon lurched. Sarah grabbed Grace's hand. Thomas's eyes went wide. Emma pressed against the canvas, watching the water rise against the wagon sides. "Tell us a story." "Aunt Grace," Emma said, voice steady despite fear. Grace's mind went blank. Then she remembered her mother's favorite tale. Once there was a girl who planted a garden in impossible soil. She talked them through the crossing, weaving the story around their fear. The girl in the tale planted seeds in rocky ground. Nothing grew until she learned to be patient, to tend what seemed hopeless, to believe in things she couldn't yet see. The wagon wheels caught bottom on the far side. Michael drove the oxen up the muddy bank. They were across. "Did the garden grow?" Sarah asked. "Eventually," Grace said, better than she ever imagined. That evening, families gathered around fires sharing relief. They'd all made it across without loss. Grace prepared supper while the children played nearby. Michael worked on harness leather that had gotten soaked. Emma approached with Thomas trailing behind. "Aunt Grace, what happened to your family?" Grace's hand stilled over the pot. "Emma, that's not," Michael started. "It's all right." Grace set down the spoon. She'd known this question would come. "What do you want to know?" "Did they get sick?" "Yes. Cholera. It happened very fast." "Like our mama," Thomas said. Grace nodded. "I imagine so. One day they were here. The next they were gone." "Do you miss them?" Emma asked. "Every heartbeat." "We miss Mama too," Emma said. "Papa says she's in heaven now, watching us." "Do you think she can see us?" Grace looked at these children, so earnest and brave. "I think if heaven is real, your mama wouldn't take her eyes off you for a second." "What about your mama?" Sarah asked. "Mine too," Grace whispered. The children nodded, accepting this. They understood loss in ways Grace wished they didn't have to. After the children slept, Michael poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside Grace at the fire. "You didn't have to answer them," he said. "They deserve the truth." Grace wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Tell me about Martha." Michael was quiet a moment. "She was strong, practical. When I told her I wanted to go west, She said we'd need 3 wagons worth of supplies and started making lists. He smiled at the memory. She planned everything down to the last nail. Died 3 days after Sarah was born. But she made me promise first that I wouldn't turn back. She sounds remarkable. She was. Michael stared into the fire. Some days I can barely remember her face. Other days I see her in Emma's expressions, hear her in the way Thomas laughs. It's easier now than it was. Does it stop hurting? No, Michael said honestly. But you learn to carry it different. Learn to live alongside it instead of under it. Grace thought about that. Living alongside grief instead of drowning in it. The children love you already, Michael said. You know that they're easy to love. Grace repeated her earlier words. I'm glad you stayed with us. Grace. Michael's voice was rough. Glad my children had enough sense to see what I almost missed. Grace looked at him across the firelight. Saw the same shadows she carried reflected in his eyes. 2 people who'd lost everything. Building something new from scraps and hope. So am I, she whispered. The mountains rose ahead like a wall against the sky. The wagon train had been climbing for 3 days, and every mile got harder. Steep grades tested oxen and people both. Wagons had to be unloaded, hauled up section by section, then reloaded at the top. Grace worked until her back screamed and her hands bled. She helped steady wheels, gathered rocks for traction, kept children out from underfoot while adults strained against impossible weight. At night, she fell into exhausted sleep, too tired even for dreams. But exhaustion stripped away the careful control she'd maintained. Grief waited in the margins, patient as stone. The 4th night, Grace's defenses shattered. She'd helped Michael's wagon up a particularly brutal stretch. Thomas had slipped and nearly fallen. Grace had caught him, but the terror of almost losing him cracked something open inside her. After supper, after the children settled, Grace walked away from camp and collapsed beside a boulder. The sobs came from someplace deep and primal. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sound, but her shoulders shook violently. Every loss, every fear, every moment of held-together composure came apart at once. She didn't hear Emma approach. Aunt Grace. Grace tried to stop, tried to pull herself together, but she couldn't. Papa. Emma's voice carried across the camp. Papa, something's wrong. Footsteps came running. Grace couldn't look up, couldn't stop crying, couldn't do anything but break apart. Grace. Michael's voice. Gentle. What do you need? I can't. Grace gasped. Everyone I love dies. Everyone. And you're all so kind. And the children, I can't lose them too. I can't. You won't. You don't know that. Grace finally looked up, vision blurred with tears. David was strong. Mama was healthy. They died anyway. What if it happens again? What if... Aunt Grace. Emma knelt beside her, Thomas and Sarah pressing close. You can't leave us. I'm not good for you. Grace sobbed. I'm cursed. I bring death. That's foolishness, Michael said firmly. Cholera brought death, not you. You're not cursed. Grace. You're just hurt. Around them. Grace became aware of other families watching. She heard whispers, felt the weight of judgment. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed suspicion. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried, maybe we should leave her at the next fort. Bad luck to have, that's enough. Michael stood, turned to face the watching families. His voice rang across the campsite. Grace Fletcher travels with us. She's family. We cross this mountain together or not at all. Fletcher. He'd used his own name for her. My children need her. Michael continued, and I need her. Anyone has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Silence fell. Families turned away. Conversation over. Michael looked down at Grace. You're not leaving. We won't let you. Emma, Thomas. And Sarah pressed against her, small bodies offering comfort. Grace held them close, still crying but quieter now. "We need you," Thomas whispered. "Who else will tell us stories?" Emma added. Sarah just clung tight, thumb in her mouth. Grace looked at Michael, saw absolute certainty in his eyes. He'd chosen her, in front of everyone, called her family. "I'm afraid," Grace admitted. "So am I." Michael said, "Every day I'm afraid something will happen to my children. But fear can't stop us from living." Grace. "Can't stop us from loving." Grace nodded slowly. The children helped her stand. Michael handed her his handkerchief. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow we'll tackle the next stretch together." That night, Grace lay in her bedroll staring at the dark canvas overhead. The mountain loomed above them, shadow upon shadow. But inside the wagon circle, fires burned warm. Children slept safe. Michael had called her family. She was still afraid. But maybe Michael was right. Maybe fear didn't have to win. Grace woke to Emma shaking her shoulder. "Something's wrong," the girl whispered. Grace sat up. The other children were awake too, watching her with worried eyes. "What is it?" "You're sad again?" Thomas said. "Like before. You don't talk to us anymore." Grace's stomach dropped. She'd been withdrawing without realizing it. Working mechanically, avoiding connection, preparing herself to leave them at the first settlement, protecting them by pulling away, protecting herself too. If she was honest. "I'm sorry," Grace started. "I didn't mean, are you going to leave us?" Emma's voice trembled. "I thought..." "No," Emma interrupted. "You can't leave us. We need you." Thomas nodded vigorously. "Papa needs you too. He just doesn't say it." Sarah climbed into Grace's lap and wrapped small arms around her neck. She didn't speak, just held on tight. Grace's careful walls crumbled. She held Sarah and reached for the other children. They pressed close, creating a circle of warmth in the pre-dawn darkness. "I was trying to protect you," Grace whispered. "From what?" Emma asked. "From me. From losing me like you lost your mama. But we already love you," Thomas said simply. "So it's too late for that." The logic was irrefutable. Children saw truth that adults tried to complicate. "I'm scared," Grace admitted. "We're all scared," Emma said with 7-year-old wisdom. "But we're together. That makes it better." Grace held them close, breathing in the smell of sleep-warm children. They'd chosen her. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And she'd been planning to leave them to protect her own heart. "You're right," Grace whispered. "I won't leave. I promise." "You have to tell Papa," Emma insisted. "He's sad too when you don't talk." Michael chose that moment to appear at the wagon's edge. His hair stood up on one side, and he looked worried. "Everything all right?" "Aunt Grace promised not to leave," Emma announced. Michael's expression shifted. Something like relief washed over his features. "Is that right?" he asked Grace directly. "Yes." Grace met his eyes. "I'm sorry, I was being foolish." "Not foolish," Michael said gently. "Just scared." "But we're all scared. Grace, doesn't mean we stop caring." He helped her down from the wagon. The children followed, still clustered close. "My children are wise," Michael said quietly. "Wiser than me sometimes. They saw what you were doing before I did." "They won't let me quit," Grace said with a watery laugh. "Good," Michael smiled. "Because we really do need you." The sun was rising now, painting the eastern sky gold and pink. The wagon train stirred to life around them. Above, the mountain pass waited, the last great challenge before the valley beyond. "Let's make breakfast," Grace said. "Together." They worked side by side. Michael and Grace and 3 children who'd appointed themselves guardians of her heart. Other families packed up around them. The whispers from the night before had faded. Morrison called the wagons to order. By mid-morning, they began the final push up the steepest grade. Every person capable of walking helped. Grace steadied wheels while Michael pushed from behind. The children carried water to exhausted adults. Hours passed in grinding effort. Then, near noon, Michael's wagon crested the summit. The valley spread below them, vast and green and golden with morning light. Mountains framed it on 3 sides. A river wound through the center like a silver thread. Forests and meadows stretched to the horizon. The promised land. Families gathered at the summit, staring down at their destination. Some wept. Some prayed. Some simply stood in awed silence. Grace stood with Michael and the children, looking at the valley that would become home. Thomas grabbed her hand. Emma took the other. Sarah clung to her papa's leg while he rested his hand on Grace's shoulder. "We made it," Emma whispered. "We did," Grace agreed, together, as they began the descent toward the valley. Grace felt something she'd thought died beside those 3 graves on the prairie. Not just hope, though, that was there. Something simpler and more profound. She felt like she belonged. The wagon train scattered across the valley like seeds on good soil. Families filed land claims at the government office, a canvas tent with a clerk who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier. Michael chose land beside a creek with good timber and a southern exposure. The next morning, Grace walked to the land office herself. "Grace Miller," she said, using her maiden name. "I'd like to file a claim." The clerk showed her available parcels on his rough map. Grace's finger landed on the plot directly adjacent to Michael's, following the creek north. "This one." The clerk raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He wrote out her papers. Grace signed them with hands that only shook a little. When she returned to Michael's camp, he was marking trees for cutting. He saw the papers in her hand. "You filed," he said, "right next to yours." Grace met his eyes. "If that's all right." Michael's face did something complicated. Surprise and pleasure and something deeper. "More than all right," he said quietly. "We'll need help building. Cabins go up faster with 2. They worked through October and November. The settlement took shape around them, frames rising, roofs going on, smoke beginning to curl from new chimneys. Grace and Michael built his cabin first, then started on hers. But the children moved freely between both sites, treating them as one home. Other families welcomed Grace. Mrs. Patterson apologized for her harsh words on the mountain. The women invited Grace to quilting circles and barn raisings. She began to weave into the community. No longer an outsider, but a neighbor. In early December, the first real snow fell. Michael invited Grace to share Christmas dinner. "The children would like it," he said, "and so would I." Grace accepted. She spent the week before Christmas preparing sewing small gifts for the children, preserving berries from summer stores, making Martha's cornbread recipe that Emma had taught her. Christmas Eve arrived cold and crystalline. Grace crossed the worn path between her cabin and Michael's, arms full of packages. Smoke rose from his chimney. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows. She knocked. Emma flung the door open. "Aunt Grace, you're here." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke and fresh bread. Thomas had cut boughs to decorate. Sarah had helped string berries. Michael had managed to procure real coffee somehow. And the pot bubbled on the stove. They prepared dinner together, working around each other with practiced ease. The children chattered about their plans for spring planting. Michael told stories about Christmases past. Grace felt herself relax into the warmth and belonging. After dinner, they exchanged gifts. Grace gave Emma a new dress she'd sewn. Thomas received a leather pouch for treasures. Sarah got a doll Grace had made from cloth scraps and yarn. The children gave Grace a drawing they'd made together, their 2 cabins side by side with stick figures, representing all of them. "That's us," Emma explained. Our family. Grace's throat closed. She folded the drawing carefully, pressing it against her heart. Michael stood. I have something for Grace, too. He retrieved a wooden box from the shelf. I made this for your hope chest. When you marry. Grace took the box. It was beautiful, carefully crafted, the wood smooth under her fingers. Michael. There's more. Emma interrupted. She exchanged glances with her siblings. They nodded. The three children stood in a solemn row before their father. Papa, Emma said in her most serious voice, we have a question. Michael looked puzzled. All right. Can Aunt Grace stay forever? Emma asked. As our real mama, we already decided we want her. Silence crashed down. Grace couldn't breathe. Michael's ears turned red. That's... Michael cleared his throat. That's between Miss Grace and me. He turned to Grace, crossed to where she stood frozen. Hope chest clutched in her hands. Though I'll admit, he said, voice rough with emotion, I've been working up the courage to ask the same thing. He took the box from her shaking hands, set it aside, and took her hands in his. Would you, Grace, would you stay, not just next door, but here as my wife, their mother? Grace looked at him. At this man who'd turned his wagon around for a woman standing alone, who'd defended her to the whole train, who'd called her family when she had none. She looked at the children watching with held breath and desperate hope. She thought of David and her parents, of Martha who'd wanted this land for her children. She thought of 3 graves far behind on the prairie, and the truth she'd learned on this long journey. Love doesn't replace love. It adds to it, multiplies it. I already am, Grace whispered. I've been yours since the mountain pass. Maybe since the day you stopped your wagon for a woman standing alone. The children whooped and rushed to embrace her. Michael pulled her close, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears, not grief. Though grief lived in her still, these were tears of joy and belonging and hope fulfilled. Thank you, Michael whispered against her hair, for saying yes, for staying. Thank you for asking, Grace said, for seeing me when I was invisible. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright. Grace woke in Michael's cabin, their cabin now, to the sound of children whispering excitedly in the loft. She dressed quickly and started coffee. Michael emerged from the lean-to where he'd slept, giving Grace the privacy of the cabin's sleeping corner. Good morning, he said, and his smile was different now, open, certain. Good morning. The children tumbled down the ladder, still in nightclothes. Emma carried the drawing they'd made, now carefully placed on the mantel. We're a family now, she announced. For real and forever. For real and forever. Grace agreed. They had a simple breakfast. Grace had saved precious eggs and made them into something special. Michael produced maple syrup he'd traded for. The children ate like it was a feast. Afterward, they bundled into coats and walked through the settlement. Other families called Christmas greetings. Children played in the snow. Smoke rose from every chimney, each one representing a family who'd crossed impossible distance to reach this valley. Grace stood with Michael's hand in hers, watching their children play with neighbor children. Sarah's laughter rang bright and clear. Thomas was building a snow fort with the Patterson boys. Emma was helping a younger child make a snow angel. In spring, we'll plant. Michael said, combine our land into one claim, build a bigger cabin, and a barn. Grace added, we'll need more room. Planning ahead already, Grace looked up at him. I am. For the first time in months, I can see a future. And it's good. Michael squeezed her hand. Martha would be glad. That the children have you. That they're happy. I hope so. Grace meant it. She hoped Martha could see this, could know her children were loved and safe and growing strong. And your David, Michael said gently. He'd want you to live, to love again. I know. Grace had made peace with that truth. David lived in her heart, but he'd want her to choose life. To choose this man, these children, this future they'd build together. That afternoon, Grace stood in the doorway of the cabin, their cabin looking out at the valley. Snow covered everything in white purity. Mountains rose on all sides, protective and strong. The creek ran dark between ice-covered banks. Behind her, Michael was teaching Thomas to play checkers. Emma was reading to Sarah. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee and home. Grace thought of herself standing beside 3 graves on the prairie, absolutely alone. Thought of Michael turning his wagon around. Thought of children who'd chosen her, who'd refused to let her quit. Family reformed from trail dust and shared hardship. She'd lost everything and found everything. Not the same everything. Nothing could replace what cholera had taken. But this was real too. This love. This belonging. This home. Emma appeared at her elbow. What are you thinking about? Mama. The word landed soft and perfect. Mama. I'm thinking about how far we've come, Grace said, and how glad I am to be here. Me too, Emma said. She slipped her hand into Grace's. They stood together in the doorway. Behind them, family and warmth and all the ordinary beautiful sounds of life. Ahead, a valley white with snow and green with promise. Spring would come. They'd plant crops and build a barn and watch children grow. Grace had stood alone once, surrounded by death and empty prairie. Now she stood surrounded by love, by children who called her mama, by a man who'd chosen her when she had nothing, by a community that had become home. The trail had been hard. The mountain had nearly broken her. But she'd crossed both and found something she hadn't known to hope for. She'd found her way home. Michael called them to supper. Grace turned from the doorway, Emma's hand still in hers, and walked toward lamplight and laughter and the life she'd chosen. Outside, snow fell soft and steady, covering everything in gentle white. Inside, the fire burned warm, and Grace Fletcher, no longer alone, no longer lost, smiled.